Okay, well, this morning, let's start by turning your pages in your Bibles, or maybe if you have it on an app, you can scroll through your screen, and we're going to look at the book of Esther this morning. And we're going to focus on the 4th chapter. That's where we're actually going to read from, but really the message spans more of that. We have to get a little bit of the context before we can get to that point, but chapter 4, that's where we're going to focus on. And while I'm doing that, I want to give you a warning that we're going to talk about an uncomfortable word today. Now, as you sit there, maybe you're wondering what kind of gimmick this is. You know, what did Daylon come up with this time? Why did he put a question mark on the screen? Did he intentionally mean to leave us hanging? Yes, that's true. I did intend to leave you hanging. Or maybe when I said that, you're kind of going through a list of words in your mind thinking, what kind of controversial word is he going to use? And so you're kind of running through those options. But you're just going to have to wait, as has become a common phrase these days, sorry, not sorry. But first, we're going to need some background before we get into this, into our verses. Now, I'm going to wind up giving you what's kind of like the Reader's Digest, Daylon Welliver paraphrase version of Esther to get us to this point. Because in order to get to know the person in a story, you have to know the person's story. And so for us to get to understand Esther and the point that she gets to in this story, we have to have some of that background in our mind to process to get to that place. So, a few things that we need to keep in mind. And the first is that this happens during the reign of King Xerxes in Persia. And we have to know that Xerxes was not a nice person. History tells us that King Xerxes was the king of a very powerful nation at the time. Persia was one of the world powers. And he was an erratic tyrant. This was the kind of person who went to war against other nations. He wasn't afraid to, slaughter other people if he thought he could take over some other country or land or whatever. History tells us that he had a very volatile temper, and he could largely do what he wanted. He was an absolute ruler. Now, there might have been a few customs or constraints or things that would influence him in a direction, but basically, he could do what he wanted. And early in the book, we see kind of an example of that in a smaller scale. We learn that he became displeased with his wife, who was the queen. And again, history tells us that he probably had actually more of a harem. He probably had a number of women, consorts, wives, or whatever. But the queen would have been in that favored position. She would have had that position, really kind of a position of influence and power at that point. But she was still completely subject to Xerxes' power. And an incident occurs between them. He gets mad at her, and he banishes her from his presence. He's like, I don't want to see you again, out with you, and out she goes. So they start the search for a replacement, which is where Esther comes in. They conduct this big search, and Xerxes winds up selecting Esther, who was a young Jewish woman. And this is one of these kind of providential twists in the story, because the Jews were captives in Persia at the time. This was not somebody that you would have given high odds to becoming queen. And yet we have this young woman, a person who would have had really very little, if any, power we think of in that day and age, who belonged to a people who were captives, and yet she winds up becoming the queen. That happens, and then we have Haman, who enters the story. And if you're kind of thinking of a soundtrack, that's where you get the dark music, dun, dun, dun. Haman enters the story, and he hates the Jews, and he finagles a way to get a decree from King Xerxes to have the Jews killed. Well, Esther has a cousin named Mordecai, and when he hears about this decree, when he hears what's going on, you have to understand, too, that Mordecai was Esther's cousin who adopted her because she was orphaned. Mordecai hears the news and he sends a message to Esther in the palace to tell her basically, hey, you have this position close to the king. Use your influence. Go talk to him and see what you can do. See if you can save your people. Which brings us to the third spot, which is that Esther was in a really, really bad place. She has two problems, really. The first of which is a little bit a smaller problem, of course, and that is that the king hasn't called for Esther to come be with him for a month. And she doesn't know when that's going to happen again. It's not like she knows, oh, I'm going to go see him next Tuesday and I'll talk to him then. It didn't work that way. There was no guarantee that Esther was going to have a chance to talk to him. But her second problem is really the big problem. And that is that Esther can't just go knock on his door and say, hey, do you have a minute to talk? Because the king had a rule that if anybody approached him without being invited by him, that he could kill them. I don't know about you, but that seems like a pretty significant problem. And not only is it a problem, but it also kind of illustrates who King Xerxes was, the kind of power that he had, and frankly, what kind of person he was, that he would have this rule and that people were afraid he might actually carry it out. So she sends a message to Mordecai telling him about her problems. And now we're going to pick up in Esther 4, starting in verse 12. And this morning I'm reading out of the English Standard Version. They told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and Susa was the big city, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And may God add his illumination and blessing to the reading of his word this morning. So, imagine, if you can, that you're Esther. You're in this terrible place because, on one hand, she knows that her people, many thousands of people who would have been in captivity, we don't have a census or an accurate count of that, but many thousands of people could be killed. And I'm not even really sure if we can totally comprehend the kind of pressure that would put on you, or the kind of guilt that you would feel like, oh my word, this is going to happen, and what kinds of emotions would be flooding through her as she thought about all the people that she knew, friends, neighbors, family, all of these people that she would have felt just horrible about, like this is going to happen. And yet, on the other hand, she's got to be thinking about her husband, the king. You know, this guy who wasn't afraid to go to war and just wipe everybody out. The guy who banished his last wife just because he didn't like one thing that she did. The kind of guy who had a rule where he could kill her if she approached him when she hadn't been invited. And so she could also be thinking, on the other hand, you know, I know what he's like. He's really volatile, and he's already given Haman permission to do this. I mean, what's the likelihood that he's going to reverse himself and change his mind just because I go in there? What good is it going to do? I mean, the word that I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not going to leave you hanging any longer. Esther comes to the point of surrender. She says, okay, I'll go to the king. even though it's against the law. If I die, I die. And we have to just remember for a minute what it is that Esther was giving up. I mean, in the first place, even if she was just banished, like the previous queen had been, like the example she had seen, Esther would have risen literally from the very bottom, from being an orphaned woman or an orphaned girl who would have, been in a position of basically no power whatsoever, of a captive people in another land. She had risen to what would have been basically the highest position she could have risen to at that point. And so she, at a minimum, probably had a very real fear of losing all of that. But even more so, she had a fear of losing her very life. This was a very real threat. It's hard for us to think about those kinds of things, but that would have been a very, very real threat to her. And she reaches the place where she's ready to surrender her life. And I stopped at this point in the story because I want us to stay there. Otherwise, it could be easy at this point to kind of jump ahead on the story and see that it worked out and we missed this point. Because the rest of the story is great. Esther goes to the king. He gives her an exemption. He doesn't execute her. He doesn't banish her. They get a new plan, and all the Jews are saved, and we could just say, yay, and move on. But I don't want us to overlook this point in light of the outcome, because in that moment, when Esther decided this, she didn't know any of that. She had no idea what the outcome was going to be. She made a choice that in that moment in time was complete surrender. And that word, surrender, I think is very difficult for us. It's not a thought that we like. One of the hard things about surrender for us is that we have to give up control. When we surrender to God, we don't know what He's going to ask, what He might do, what direction He might take us. Kind of like Esther didn't know what King Xerxes would do. God might call us to do something that's really hard. He might ask us to forgive somebody who hurt us, and we think they really don't deserve that. God might change the direction of our lives when we were nice and comfortable, right where we were. God might ask us to do something that jeopardizes our reputation. And we don't like that thought because we want people to like us. And we don't know what God's going to do. And so surrendering that control to Him is difficult. And part of it also, I think, sometimes comes down to a lack of trust. We don't know what God might do if we surrender to Him, and we don't trust the outcome. We think whatever that outcome might be it's undesirable, so we don't want to give up control. We want to make sure it happens the way that we've laid it out. We think we know in our infinite wisdom that the outcome should be outcome A. And if we think there's a chance that God might want to have outcome B, we just say, nope, not going to do it. And we refuse to let go of that control. Another thing that's difficult about surrender is that we might have to surrender our ability to define ourselves as we want. We want to be able to make our own choices and to define ourselves for who we want to be. We want to be able to say, well, I'm this. And you can fill in that blank if you want. We want to define ourselves by, well, I'm a job. I'm a part of a certain group. Or I want people to perceive me in a particular way as a particular person or whatever. We want to choose our own identity. We want to create our own image. We want to control ourselves. But God says that we're made in His image. Instead of getting to define ourselves however we want, if we surrender to God, we're supposed to be being made more and more into His image. Genesis, at the very beginning, tells us that we were made in his image. Paul, in Colossians 3, tells us that when we put off the old self, when we're with Christ, when we're putting on the new self, we're being renewed in his image. God defines who we are. But if we surrender to him, we might have to surrender ourselves in that way. Truthfully, if we surrender, we might have to surrender some kind of sin that I know this is going to sound a little radical, but we might have to surrender some sin that we actually kind of secretly like. Some sin that we've spent a lot of time rationalizing and we want to hang on to. You know, like maybe we have this attitude and we know it's not right, but we keep it and we try to explain it away. We try to rationalize our attitude in some way by saying, well, okay, so maybe I have this bad attitude, but at least I'm not doing anything bad, right? Is it really that bad? It's just an attitude. Or maybe we have a secret habit that we know God really wouldn't want us to have, something that's destructive in our lives. But again, we justify it. We say, well, it really isn't that bad. I mean, there are a lot of people out there doing worse things, right? So it's not very high on the list. Or we can justify by saying, well, you know, I can never be perfect, right? I know I can't be perfect, so we just kind of let that slide. Is it really so bad if I just keep doing that one thing? Or whatever our excuse is. It could also be that if you're on the fence or you've not quite decided to follow Jesus yet, maybe there's something else that you haven't been willing to surrender. To follow Jesus, we have to surrender our pride because we have to admit that we need him. And we have to admit that we can't make it all right on our own. We have to admit that Jesus really is who he says he is. And that all this time, we've been holding him at arm's length. And to come to Jesus, sometimes we have to surrender our pride and just say, I was wrong. And when we do that, we also surrender what things our friends or family or other people around us might think of us for making that decision. And then I put on the end of the list here that there are 1,000 other things. Those were just the 4 that came to mind as I was working on this. But there are all kinds of other things that if we surrender to God, we might have to surrender that we don't want to. But to live the life that God calls us to, we have to reach that same point of surrender. Our walk with Jesus only works if we totally abandon our direction and walk with him. It's kind of hard to walk with Jesus if we insist on where we want to go. I mean, just imagine if one of his earthly disciples had come to him at the beginning and said, oh, Jesus, I really want to follow you. And so Jesus says, oh, that's really awesome. Okay, great, follow me. We're going to go over here today. And that disciple said, well, about that. I really want to go over this other way today, but can I do that and still follow you? Is that okay? Right? It doesn't work. Luke 17:33 tells us that whoever tries to keep their life, when we try to keep control of our lives, whenever we try to keep it all to ourselves and make it all happen for ourselves, whoever tries to keep their life actually loses it. And it's only when we lose our life by surrendering it to him that he preserves it. We see in our story today that for Esther to surrender, for her to put herself in that position, would have been the hardest thing she could have ever done. And yet, it was also the bravest thing she could have done. to give up that control, to not know what the outcome would be, to potentially sacrifice herself with maybe nothing to show for it. That would have been incredibly hard, and yet she did it. And her example gives us courage. It gives us hope that we can surrender it all to God like she did. But that's not the only aspect of surrender this morning. I want to point out that when we surrender those things like our control or pride or whatever, we also get to surrender other things. When we give our lives over to God, we get to surrender our fears because we put our lives in His hands. We can surrender our anxiety over the future because we place our trust in Him over what's going to happen. I think we have an awful lot of anxiety in our lives when just over us trying to manage our own lives. We're trying to make our own things happen. We want everything to turn out. We work really hard to make our lives turn out the way we want. And in the end, we never make it perfect. It never always works out exactly like we want. We have all this anxiety over it. And when we surrender to Him, we can unburden ourselves of that anxiety. We can surrender our need to control other people. Sometimes I think we get tempted. We see people in our lives that we love and care about, and we're concerned about their future, and we want to do things. We want to control a situation. We want to pull the strings. Maybe we don't think of it in this way, but in a way we kind of want to manipulate the situation so that their lives will turn out great. And that doesn't work. Trying to control other people doesn't work. It never achieves what we want. It only causes an unhealthy relationship. And if we can surrender them to God, then that frees us to simply love them, to simply be in their lives. We can also surrender the mess that we've made out of our lives. We can take those, whether it's choices we've made, whether it's things that have happened to us that were beyond our control. Our lives get messy, and we can turn that over to Him. We can let Him redeem it. We can let Him turn our lives into something beautiful. We also get to surrender to God's reckless love. We get to surrender to His kindness. We get to surrender to His path for our lives. They might be paths that we never would have chosen for ourselves, never would have thought of, never thought we'd be in that place. Yet He brings us to good places when we surrender. Places where we can grow, places where we can experience His grace, places that we never ever would have reached otherwise had we not given it over to Him. So I'm sure that we get scared when we reach that point where we feel like we're going to have to surrender something, like that I'm sure that Esther was. But I want us to remember that when we do it, we also get to surrender in these ways as well. Finally, when we surrender, it makes us more like Jesus. When Jesus was facing crucifixion, He knew what was down the road. He knew the kind of horrific, the suffering, the physical suffering, the emotional suffering as people walked away from Him, the spiritual agony that He would find as felt like He was being abandoned. What does Matthew 26:39 tell us, though, in that moment? Even Jesus was facing that struggle. He even asked God, "If it be your will, take this from me." He wasn't looking forward to what he was faced with. And he even starts by saying, if it be your will, take this cup from me, but nevertheless, not what I will, but your will be done. Jesus himself had to surrender. And if we're going to follow Jesus, we also need to come to that place where maybe we say, I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me if I let go. I'm afraid of what's going to happen if I let go of my control, of myself, my pride, or whatever else you want to fill in the blank with. But nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. Just like Esther did, I'm going to go, and if I perish, I perish. As we get ready to end our service today, and that's going to come up. And so we're going to do something a little different. You know, sometimes we do kind of some different things. Sometimes we sing together. But today, Annette's going to sing a song for us. And it's the song is called Make Room, if you've never heard of it. And I just wanted to put a few of the lyrics up just to kind of preview that for you so you can have kind of the thought in your mind. And as she sings, if you simply want to listen to the song, take the words in, meditate, pray on some of these things, that's great. The altar's also going to be open. If there's something you feel like you need to come forward and surrender, that's going to be open as well. But I just wanted to highlight a few phrases here from the song. And it says, "Here is where I lay it down, every burden, every crown." And that crown might be our pride, it might be our accomplishments, whatever we think we have that we should have earned. We may have to lay all that down. This is my surrender. Here is where I lay it down, every lie, and those lies might be those things that we've rationalized, where we've lied to ourselves about those things. It might be lies that we've gotten from other places, from the world, from the enemy, whatever. We lay all that down. Every doubt we lay down. This is my surrender. And I will make room for you to do whatever you want to. So again, as she sings, the altar's going to be open. I'm not trying to guilt anybody to come forward. That's not the point. I don't think that's ever effective. That's not what I want. But I will say this, that if the reason you don't come forward, like you feel like you should, but you don't come forward, is because you're thinking, whatever. I don't want people to see me coming forward and speculate about, oh, what are they having to surrender in their life? What's going on there, right? Or maybe it just seems kind of awkward or embarrassing. Maybe that's something you need to surrender today, too. If you need to, just come forward to lay down your pride, your doubt, your burdens, whatever, and make room for God to do what he wants to do today. But just remember that when you surrender, you get to surrender that fear and doubt and anxiety. And you get to surrender to his love and his direction for your life. And if you want, you can just come to the altar, and I'm sure other people and myself will be glad to pray with you as well. Annette?